Next, let's talk about fields on output, field rendering, or interlacing your outputs. Well, the first question you need to ask is, do I want to interlace my output? Do I want to field render? If your output is video, and if you have interlaced sources, you probably want to interlace your output. That's going to give you the smoothest motion with no strobing or staggering to the motion. Really nice for smooth text animations and such. On the other hand, if all of your inputs were progressive scan, you're not really going to get anything by field rendering the output. If you didn't have fields and all that motion on input, you're not going to suddenly make it up on output. If you've created animations from scratch inside After Effects, such as text animations and other synthetics, and if your output is video, well, maybe you do want to field render your output, maybe you don't. Field rendering is going to give you smoother motion. On the other hand, it's perfectly fine to not field render your output. Give a progressive scan render. Turn on the motion blur switches. This will give you a more filmic look. Fast motion will stutter, but it's going to have a little bit of a more dreamy sort of appearance. So you really should do test renders and see what you like. If the output is destined for the computer screen, you don't want to field render. You don't want to interlace your output. Remember, computer screens do not draw in an interlaced fashion. And if you try to play back interlaced video on a computer screen, it's just going to look funky. There is no point in field rendering anything that's not destined for video or for a video frame size. So don't worry about field rendering anything for, say, an iPod or something like that. Okay, what if we have interlaced sources, but we're going to play back on a computer screen, or we definitely want progressive output? Well, that's a special case because we've got a little bit of a resolution problem here, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Let's say we've determined that we definitely want to field render our output. Okay, the first thing we need to figure out is, what is the field order of the output? Now again, we can make some intelligent guesses a lot of the time as to what the field order may be. If we're going to standard def DV, it's going to be lower field first. If we're going to field render HD output, it's going to be upper field first. PAL D1, upper field first. NTSC D1, we don't know. It's probably lower field first, but not always. Ask the person who's going to be ultimately playing back your file what field order they would prefer. Now hopefully they're going to tell you what the field order is, but occasionally they're going to tell you what the field dominance is. Field dominance is a term that's sometimes used interchangeably with field order, and it shouldn't be. It has to do with how videotape is edited. It has nothing to do with what's happening in a frame on a computer. Quite often when someone tells you the field dominance, they really mean the field order, but not always. So to be absolutely safe in these cases, you're going to want to run a test animation, one upper field first, one lower field first, and see which one actually plays back correctly on the final output chain you're going through. We just make something as simple as objects moving up and down or rotating. This is just a real simple test animation. It's short, it's loopable, and it's going to very much tell you if things are working right or not working right. Because if they're working wrong, the motion is going to look really weird. Okay, we've decided to field render. We now know the field order. How do we set the field order in a program like After Effects? So once you have your composition, go ahead and set it up to render. Make Movie or Command M in After Effects. In After Effects, you want to deal with the render settings. So click to the right of render settings, and in there is a section called time sampling. Remember, we've said fields have a lot to do with time. This is where you want to do your work. You can pick in After Effects whether you want to go upper field first or lower field first. Most times we're going lower field first if we're doing anything standard def. Now you notice that the comp's frame rate stayed the same, 29.97, which happens to be the right frame rate for NTSC video. Earlier we mentioned that the field rate is actually double the frame rate, 59.94. You don't need to worry and set this yourself inside After Effects, because After Effects is smart enough to go ahead and say, hey, your field rendering, I know I need to render 2 fields at different points in time for every frame. So you're cool, don't sweat it. Click OK, and you're ready to go. The last thing we do usually to let people know just what the file is we'll just add to the output name. Things like LFF for lower field first, just so it's in the file what the field order is. Now, one issue that catches a lot of people out when they field render is what happens to the motion blur. Motion blur is based on the duration or length of the frame being rendered. When you field render, you're now rendering at effectively twice the frame rate. Therefore, the duration of a frame is half what it used to be, and now your motion blur is suddenly half as long as it was when you were previewing in After Effects. So let me show you how to proof this in After Effects so you don't get caught out. First, let's look at where we set the motion blur length. Have your comp open in After Effects. I'll click here to bring it forward. and click either Command or Control K to bring open the composition settings. Underneath the Advanced tab is where you set your shutter angle. One frame is considered to have 360 degrees of motion blur. The larger this number, the more motion blur you'll have. I'll set it at 360 for now just so we can see our blur. The next thing you need to do is set up motion blur for the layers. There's a switch in the timeline that turns on motion blur for individual layers. You need to set this for each layer that you want blurred. So I'm going to click it on for both the blue box and for the orange spinner. Now to prove your motion blur in After Effects, you need to be able to see it in the composition. To do that, there's an additional motion blur switch here in the timeline window that allows you to see motion blur while you're working. Okay, now you see a little bit of blurring around my edges. That is the effect of motion blur in After Effects. Go back to my comp settings for a second. I've got my frame rate at 29.97, which is my proper NTSC rate. And this would be the blur if I rendered progressively at 29.97. Let's take a snapshot of that. Now let's go back into comp settings and simulate field rendering by doubling the comp's frame rate, 59.94. Okay? Suddenly, you see a lot less motion blur on these objects, the blue box and the orange spinner. Now I'll go ahead and compare our snapshot. This is with field rendering. This is without field rendering. With and without. A lot of people get surprised when they have a design that they really like the looks of in After Effects, go to field render the final, and suddenly the final has a lot less motion blur on it. Temporarily set your frame rate higher in After Effects so that you can see what the motion blur is really going to look like on final render. The last thing to discuss about rendering interlaced material is what the render queue in After Effects looks like while you're rendering. I'll click on the render button, and you'll notice next to this frame count is an additional number with U and L. That indicates whether After Effects is rendering the upper field or the lower field at this particular point in time. If you look at the comp window while you're rendering, you'll see these interlaced lines, which can indicate that you have interlacing in the material being rendered out by After Effects at this moment. So if you see these additional numbers, don't become concerned. This is what After Effects is supposed to be doing.